G'day, I'm Patrick and I am an adult man with a treehouse. I also have a toddler, but this treehouse was conceived long before the toddler was. And I'm here to do a bit of work on it. With the appearance of children in me and my mates' lives, we no longer had time for our treehouse, which is a very sad situation, but it needs some work. And the thing I'm doing today is putting a lock on the door so that our toddlers can come up here and not fall off the edge. So I made myself a glass door, but the timber frame is a non-traditional size, which means that I don't really have distance to install a standard lock set. I don't need a big hefty security lock on this door, but I just need some way of making sure it stays shut. I'm gonna make a simple lock out of some brass rod that I bought for some other project, and I'm gonna install it on site. So in this video, you're gonna learn how to make a really simple latch, and you're also gonna learn some tips to get really straight, perfect holes when you're drilling on site away from your drill press. In general, you can cut aluminium and brass on some, not all, of your woodworking machinery. The Mitre saw, the drop saw, will cut brass and aluminium, non-ferrous metals, not iron, not steel. You just gotta go really slowly. And ideally, what non-ferrous metals want is a negative rake triple chip grind on the teeth. This blade behind me is a Freud blade that has a negative rake. It doesn't have triple chip teeth, but this is a fairly small cut. I'm gonna rub a bit of wax on the blade first. You might have seen me use this before. It's a super handy thing to have. The drop saw, Mitre saw, it's not a particularly accurate machine. None of them are. There's just too much flex. And usually the space where you're cutting stuff is just too wide to effectively support small pieces. So by making yourself a sled like this that you can just clamp into place, it gives you the ability to cut really small pieces of timber and brass without them flying off and them being properly supported on the back and on the front. This is just some 19mm plywood. Has a little fence at the back. I've put one cut in for straight, one cut in for 45. Obviously you can do as many cuts as you want. This will just clamp down here and here. And you just need to obviously make sure that this lines up with the blade every time. Such a cheap piece of kit. It's so useful. It stops, if you're cutting little pieces of dowel, stops them flying back into the saw. It'll take you 2 minutes to make. It's super handy. Make sure you're wearing glasses. I'm going to try and explain my plan for this latch. It might make sense more when you see the actual door, but I'll illustrate it here. This is the profile of the door timber. The glass comes to here, which leaves me about, I don't know, whatever that is, 75mm from where the glass is to the front of the door edge. I want to place a brass pin in there, which will act as a latch, and I've got to be able to move that from both sides. So I'm going to transect that brass pin with another little brass pin. So this brass pin will be in a hole that goes into the timber like that, so that this can slide back and forth. There will be a slot on both sides that this little pin sits in and will slide back and forth. So I need to be able to drill a hole perfectly through the center of this rod so that I can put this one in. Then I need to drill all of those holes in the timber, and I need to be able to do it on site. So I need to drill a hole through the center of this 12mm brass rod. I need it to be pretty well centered, but this isn't high precision machining, so it's not critical. The little pin that goes through is measuring at 4.77, which must be some sort of imperial. I think it's maybe 3/16. Someone should correct me on that. I tried a 5mm and it was just too loose. And I tried a 4.72 and it worked really well with a tiny bit of sanding. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna show you one trick that will allow you to find the center of a round object. For this trick to work, you need a drill bit with a precision point. So a brad point bit will be fine, or something else that has a machined central point. What we're going to do is place a flat object in between the drill bit and our round, and we're just going to press it down gently until it comes in contact. Now, when this sits perfectly flat, that's when we know our drill bit is exactly in the center of our stock. So this is still leaning down to my left slightly, and that's sitting perfectly flat. So now I know this is sitting central to the bit. In order to drill these components on site, I'm going to make a jig. But before we make the jig, I just need to figure out exactly how all of this is going to work, figure out the measurements, etc., so I can make the jig work for me. We need to get a line that goes from the sides to the front edge and back around the sides, and they need to be all perfectly in line. So I'm going to use my square, and I'm going to use a blade. Now, once I've made my jig, I won't need to do this again. Hold your square firmly, run the blade along the square. Now, when you go to transfer that line to this edge, we're going to rest the blade in that line and then slide the square up to the blade. And then we continue that line along the front edge. And that makes sure that they're in exactly the same place. I'm going to do the same thing to transfer around this side. Place the blade in the line, bring the square up to the line, and then continue that line across. So now we have our reference line cut, scored into the timber. We need to figure out the center point of this edge here. A couple of ways you can do that. I'm just going to measure this. This is 36 exactly, so I know that my center point is 16 mils. I'm going to use a little marking gauge like this, bring that down to 16 mils, and I'm going to do that from both sides. I'm not going to go straight onto the location and assume this is right. I'm going to do this further up or further down, out of the way, from both sides, and make sure that line falls at exactly the same position when this is used from both sides of the timber. Okay, wildly wrong, because a 16 plus 16 is not 36. I need 18 plus 18. Now I need to figure out how far back along the face of the door frame that slot needs to go for the little handle, the little pin. This little pin's measuring at 4.65. I'm going to start by doing my slot at 5mm. If I was doing this in the shop, I would just use the 5mm bit on the domino. But I'm going to be doing this on site, so I'm going to create a jig that allows me to drill multiple holes and then clean out the waste with a chisel. That gives us the location of the slot. To find the center point of the two external drilling holes, I just need to move the edges in by 2.5mm, which is half the distance, half the diameter of the drill bit that I'm going to use. Because our two holes are going to cross over, they're going to interact, we need to kind of be aware of what order we're doing them in to reduce the amount of tear out that we have. Our little slot that we're cutting, because it's going to involve a chisel and probably some filing and some sandpaper, I want to do that first before the large bolt hole has gone through. Because if we do the bolt hole first, and then we're trying to chisel out that little slot, the inside of those holes are just going to tear straight into the bolt hole. So little slot first, and then drill the hole straight through. I drilled 4 little holes to make my slot. I'm now going to use a really sharp blade to mark the extent of the mortise, and then I'm going to cut down the waste with a chisel. It's important to slice the extent of the mortise first with a knife because it severs the wood fibers, which means that the chisel can cut that surface really cleanly and you know exactly where you need to place the chisel. To find the location where I need to place my square, I'm gonna hold my blade on the furthest point of one of those drill holes, slide my square up to that blade location, and then score that line. Same thing from the other side. Now I can rest my chisel exactly in that little slice line that I made with the knife, and just a couple of taps with a mallet and it'll clean that right up. If you have a lot of waste to remove, like your slot is much bigger, don't start right on a line. Remove as much waste as possible and do your final cut on that line. I'm not going all the way through, I'm going to come through from both sides. If you keep punching that chisel all the way through the backside, it's just going to blow out the backside really badly. Alright, that's pretty good. The inside's going to be drilled out anyway, so the center 12mm doesn't really matter. I'm going to create a tiny sandpaper file to smooth that out anyway. But look, you could do that with a trim router. The reason I didn't was I felt like getting the alignment right from front to back would be much trickier using a trim router from both sides than it was just drilling straight through on the drill press. Now, when I do this on location, I'm going to create a drilling jig, which will allow me to drill really straight, and you'll be seeing that process too. If you get nothing from this video, the sandpaper file might be the best tip. Make them to any profile you want. This is about 4mm thick, with a little bullnose. So it's going to fit into my slot perfectly and allow me to clean out the sides of the holes as well as the mortise. Some double-sided tape, some sandpaper. Stick your timber to your double-sided tape. If you are doing a curved edge, make sure you roll it around really tightly. Use a Stanley knife to cut off the excess. Okay, make sure that's pressed down really firmly. Get all this stuff stuck to your fingers. Cut yourself a piece of sandpaper that will fit. Take the tape off. Okay, let's start with the center, the bullnose. Push that down really hard and roll this over to the tape on one side. Roll it over onto the tape on the other side. All right. Cut the sandpaper away from the inside. It'll still destroy your knife, so use a snap blade. Sandpaper file takes 2 minutes. You get a perfectly shaped thing to smooth out whatever thing you're making. Can be any size you like, and it costs nothing. The hole is looking super uniform and neat. Makes me very happy. Now we've got to drill in the hole from that side. If you were worried about tear out, you just need to create something that fits into that existing slot. So in this case, a 6mm domino would kind of fit in there perfectly and would prevent a bunch of tear out. I might as well throw one in there. I've got them laying around. Okay, holes work. Let's put the pin in, see if it works. Okay, this goes in first. Got a little sand, looks crappy. Works pretty well. I just need to make some jigs now so that I can do this in the actual door. I also kind of want a spring in there. I bought some springs and I can't find them, so I'm gonna have to hunt around. But that will mean that it remains, it's like stays latched. It doesn't wiggle open with vibration or wind on the door. The key to making a drilling jig that you can use on site is quite simple. You just need a piece of hardwood with a hole that is straight and a way to clamp that in the right location to your piece of work. So we've made a prototype of this lock. I know that it works now. I have the measurements. I'm gonna actually use this as part of the drilling jig. There's my hole, it's in the right location. I just need to cut this down so that I can then clamp this onto the edge of my door. And I need to make a corresponding bit that allows me to do those little slots. So I'm gonna mess with this and put some ply on the side of it. So our original prototype with a central hole that forms part of our jig. These are our 3 drilling locations. I left some meat in between there so that I can actually get the drill straight. If I'd done 4 holes like I did on the slot, it would be a pretty useless jig. So there'll be a little bit more work on the side. Those holes are located in the same proportion as those, but 30 mil in from the edge, which means I'm gonna glue these 2 together on that 30 mil line that I've drawn there. Make sure it's perfectly straight, and then that's essentially our jig. I can clamp it onto the door this way. It's just very important that you have those reference lines. You probably can't see them, but there's a knife line there and a knife line through those holes, that we get those lined up perfectly. Because if they're offset, then our holes aren't going to intersect. And that's the only way that we have to know where this is going to be positioned and to make sure that it does what it needs to do. I'm going to glue this together with just some PVA, some clamps. It is important that I get this really lined up, so I'll put some pressure on with the clamps with some glue in there and then shimmy it around until it lines up perfectly with that line. One more handy tip for you. When you're trying to glue PVA stuff together, it tends to slide around everywhere. Put a tiny sprinkle of salt over that joint and it'll act as an abrasive and hold them in the right location while you clamp them together. Doesn't need to be much, but it just provides a bit of friction. I need a way to mark the exact location of the hole in the door frame so that this lock works. I don't want it to have a lot of slop, I want it to go in exactly where I want it to be. One way to do that is actually use the locking pin itself as the marking gauge by placing a tiny little spike on the end, so you just jam it closed a couple times when the door is held in the right position, and that's going to leave a little divot in the door frame. Now, I could throw this onto a metal lathe and put a tiny pin on the end, but I don't have a metal lathe. I could probably put a tiny point on it on the drill press, but I don't think it would be very good. I'm going to mark the exact center. I'm going to show you a fun trick for that. I'm going to place them on the table. Scribe a line on the end. Turn it 90 degrees. Scribe that line again. If you want to, you can scribe a few more lines, and that'll give you the dead center of this pin. Once we have the dead center, we can punch that with a center punch, and then that way we can drill a tiny hole in it. Drill a little tiny hole that fits a little nail, and then place the nail in there that can be then removed. It means that my locking pin will always have a tiny little hole in it, but no one's really going to see it, and it's going to help me mark center really easily. A great way of finding center of a cylinder or a dowel of a certain size is get yourself a matching drill bit. Now, it needs to be a brad point bit. I like this set, it's extensive. Ooh, it's got lots of bits in it. You could also use any Forstner bit because they also have a brad point bit, but it has to be the same size. So 12 mil brass rod, 12 mil brad point drill bit. Couple of interesting treehouse facts. We're on an island on a giant dam, essentially a lake in Victoria. We're in a couple of giant eucalypts, and the whole thing is the treehouse is mounted in 4 eucalypts on sliding bolts. So as the trees move, the treehouse can float with it because these trees do move in the wind. The low side where I am on the deck here is about standard kind of 2nd story height, about 3 meters up. We're on the island, has a bit of a slope to it, so the high side is probably 5 meters high from the ground. I made this glass door using some American oak for the sides and the whatever that is called, rails. And I need to put some sort of latch in it, just here. Now I've done most of the fabrication of the latch in the workshop. I've made some jigs to make this easy. We just need to place it all on here and get this secure. This jig allows me to get the placement for the hole for the pin and the hole for the latch slider all lined up And so by clamping this to the door, it means it stays in one place. I'm setting this latch fairly high up because of toddlers. I figure by the time they can reach it, they might be responsible enough to open and close this door by themselves. I'm sure there's specific codes about lock placement, but we're in a treehouse, so I don't think the codes apply. I'm going to clamp a block on the back side of the door where the drill bit is going to protrude so that I don't get a whole bunch of tear out. Just need to figure out a way to do that that doesn't impede my access on the front as well. Jig is locked in place, backing pieces in place, everything's clamped in tight. I'm going to do these holes first, and I'll clean out the waste with a chisel, and then I'll drill the main pinhole. I need to take this off to clean out those holes, but I'm going to mark a little line with a knife on the edge of the door so that I can put this back in exactly the same place when I go to drill the corresponding hole on the front. I'm going to use a square and a blade to mark the extent of that mortise. So draw a little line on the top and the bottom on both sides so that I have a place for the chisel to sit and get a really nice clean mortise without tear out. So I drilled the 3 holes. I had to chisel out the insides very gently so I didn't break the glass. And now I have my sandpaper file, which is a stick with some sandpaper on it, and that's going to clean up that hole so that it all looks all neat. I've radiused the edge of that piece of timber so it matches the inside of the mortise. It's just a really simple way to reshape stuff if you need to. Now I'm going to place the jig back in exactly the same location it was before, making sure it lines up with my little knife line. And I'm going to use my 12.5mm drill bit to drill the hole on the end here. Need to make sure it doesn't go too deep or I will hit the glass, destroy my drill bit, break the glass, have to make a new door. So I'll mark a line on this drill bit. Chances are I'll have to do the start of the hole with the jig and then take the jig off and finish it. But there will be enough hole drilled in the door to act as a guide so it will remain straight. That's as far as I can go with the jig in place. Now I'm going to place my pin in and push it across so that the little nail brad point goes into the door frame, so I know exactly the location I need to drill the hole for the sliding bolt. Well, thanks a lot for joining me in the treehouse. It's getting pretty warm in here, it's probably time for a swim. I have a fully functioning door lock now, which I'm pretty satisfied with. Very solid, very simple, very demure. Hope you've enjoyed this. I'm sure I'm going to have more bits and pieces to do up here. It's a great excuse to get up here and do some work. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. There'll be some links down below for some of the products I've used, and I'll see you next week.